Hello everyone, today we talk about the Achaemenid order of battle in Xerxes' invasion of Greece in 480 BC. I restarted the Persian Wars / Classical Greece series. We'll update it every once in a while. It's been 2 years that I had stopped, and reason being I hadn't found enough satisfactory material to build up efficiently my videos, but it was just laziness at the end of the day. So today we talk about this interesting aspect. Of course, the best source is the best thing would be to read Herodotus in the first place, mostly about the list of the contingent is in book 7 from 60 to 97, and for the guards, same book 40-41 before. But it just the whole story, all the Goat War debate between Xerxes, Mardonius, Artabanus, etc. It's one of the most famous, most beautiful studied passages in classical literature. And all the preparations, the isthmus on the Athos Mountain, the crossing of the Hellespont, and all these things that show you the greatness, naturally, that the Hellenes tended to exaggerate, right, about especially the numbers, the size, of the quote barbarians, and the Achaemenids were notoriously one of the most advanced and refined military cultures in the ancient world, surely more advanced than the Hellenic one, and that's also a good didactic example of how being the most advanced power is definitely not. It doesn't ensure success just by itself. Yesterday we started a series about the Vietnam War, so it's always an interesting remark to make. We will have to make videos about properly the Achaemenid army, also in the multi-secular transformation. Its forces today. Naturally, we talk about this early 5th century BC reality, but elsewhere, I think we already made something about also the Alexander's times and other moments in between. Things did change, right? Today we talk about the order of battle of Xerxes' invasion force, but we will not, for example, describe the equipment of all the ethnicities that were levied for the expedition. That also, we have a few info, right? It's mostly Herodotus and some iconographic monumental sources, etc., and other, hints. But we're talking about a quite archaic time still, right? Historically speaking, you can argue that modern historiography is born actually with the Persian Wars, and generally speaking, we rely on a too scanty amount of information to be categorical about the whole thing. And the main problem, naturally, of this order of battle is the exaggeration of numbers. That is basically the wall by Herodotus, as we fundamentally have no Persian source listing the composition of their own armies. We just have Hellenic historians. So naturally, these numbers by themselves are not reliable in absolute terms, but in relative terms, they surely provide actually they can be very revealing, and even in a coherent way, given especially the composition of the army. More of that later. So we start definitely. There is just Herodotus, right? The army that Xerxes took to Greece is listed by the Hellenic author, and much has been written on this passage. I'm definitely no expert in Hellenic literature and so on, but it's been suggested that this entire passage is fundamentally a fiction, right? As Herodotus properly wouldn't have that information at hand, even if he had it. He wouldn't have not been able to translate it by himself, but surely he had traveled and he knew, right? He had heard. Oral sources here are dramatically important for most ancient authors. They say things, but we ignore what their sources were, right? And some said that in particular such lists would have been essentially laid out on and expanded on the base of a list of Achaemenid possessions which Hecataius used to impress the leaders of the Ionian revolt. This is Herodotus 5:36. However, a more accurate, analysis, let's say, pointed out that Hecataius' part in the Ionian revolt might itself have been a rhetorical device of Herodotus, right? So such a catalog might have, for which the author would have copied from, may have never actually existed in the first place, right? And Herodotus' list has also its own problems, right? But generally speaking, it fits the fairly well known for the time standards Achaemenid policy of levying troops throughout the empire. Remember, this is a universal ecumenic empire. Technically, Greece was within it, right? Historiographically, as Westerners, we developed, of course, the idea of the in and the out, of the fact that Western civilization was born with certain definite characters there, that that there is all an idea that we kind of somewhat fabricated about the democratic and the modern mindset being born in a fixed way. In reality, this was being born, but it was definitely not even prevalent and far from being so, and it would never be fundamentally also what we invented by the 19th century as this kind of utterly modernistic and positivistic view of what happened. Most Greeks felt themselves to be part of the Achaemenid Empire, right? Simply because not just the Ionian ones that were literally in Anatolia and but literally also later on. Basically, all but Athens and Sparta opposed the Achaemenid invasion. Basically, the other Hellenic powers simply accepted to grant land and water, right, as an act of submission to the King of Kings. And this is an idea that is, I guess it's famous today. I mean, it's easy to get acquainted to it in modern times if somebody hears it, but it's not dramatically fashionable, right? But it really solves a lot of problems. An ecumenic empire is an ecumenic empire. That is, nobody's out, right? And these city-states that were fundamentally starting to oppose, that had already actually fought and defeated the first Achaemenid invasion, were seen as just, in fact, barbarians from an Achaemenid perspective in this remote western, peninsula, right? That was yet to boom as it would happen, just starting especially from these victories that had already, provided some agitation, same Ionian revolt, etc. The reasons for which the Achaemenid thought better to invade Greece, and that were rebelling to this idea, and it surely displays an important feature, let's say, of what would become a sort of Western identity, an insight, in perspective, but there is nothing teleological in it, right? The games were yet to be made, but they were being made. They were starting being made. So everybody also more or less knew what the Persians were doing in general, right? Everybody had seen. Think about Darius' Scythian campaign. We even talked about that. We made that video about Scythian warfare, for example. There are historiographically this list Herodotus provides is coherent, right? But the Persian invasion historiography, and therefore it's somewhat reliable, especially in this quite detailed description of the ethnic contingents that participated to them. And as we were saying before, this is one of the most famous pieces of information from ancient historiography, because it not just shows this critical kind of analytical capacity there was to mate Western historiography, Western thought, etc. But properly, and this is what we should be amazed before anything else, the enormity of such Achaemenid military organization, the expedition, the campaign, all the supply, the logistical nuisances, and all, right? So the modern mind coldly approaches this list and says, okay, well, it's boring, we have to read now all these contingents. All this means that the entire world was mobilized against the Greeks, right? So, and this was real, right? Because as we will see from the contingents, literally, these people came from every freaking where. And we know what was the might of the Achaemenid Empire at the time. So, in general, there is the problem of the numbers that, as you will see, come to astonishing ciphers in a way. So we will count them later. But you may also think in such a huge campaign, naturally there were certain detachments for garrisoning certain areas that had been occupied, etc. Yes, but the idea is that this was a single army. And for this reason, we have to be realistic about before a principle of concentration of forces if anything, right? And eventually, as you know, also how the campaign developed and all the problems to supply the army, the supplying ships fundamentally were always, proceeding along the coast. So, and also from this first datum that we get to these, that in Herodotus' list there is a split between infantry and cavalry forces, we get, for obvious organical reasons, that we are talking about a single army, right? We're not talking about different contingents that were proceeding in a different strategical area. No, these were all together. Then, of course, some units were scattered. Some were, as we were saying before, living as garrisons. Considered that there were, as we'll see, also other Greeks that would join the Persians during the campaign, and things like that. But we're talking about a single body, that is, an army that would be used tactically, right, as a single unit. And for this reason, we have to be realistic about the fact that this might have not exceeded 50,000 fighting men, right, which is already probably too much. And we will try to realize here what the sources were. But 50,000 men, right, we're talking about fighting force and field aids most altogether. By 480 BC is literally the ecumenic force moved, because nobody had the means at the time to mobilize such an enormous force, right? So, of course, the millions, etc., it's pure fantasy. I mean, it doesn't even, it's not to be taken, it happens sometimes on YouTube. I get people that get, annoyed because I say that, these times more than 50,000 men together was unfeasible to command in a field. But it's literally it, right? We know it by organizational standards. We know it worked, there was an excess that was exponential, right? The more men you put in, right? So it's not a matter of a sum, right? The larger the army, the more multiplied, and all the problems deriving from it. Properly from a strategical point of view, which means that if we're keeping 50,000 men in a place fixed, these people would fundamentally exhaust all the local resources. The hygienic situations would have become dear, and so therefore they had to be always fundamentally on the move, to be constantly supplied by an astronomical amount of supplies of every kind. Just think about water. People think about supplies for the horses. There's already a big thing. Achaemenid cavalry was really a thing, for example, or the men, etc. But here, the first and foremost thing in any army, the water. Here we're talking about tons and tons and tons every day, and it had to be properly carried. Right, it's not like a supply you can't stock and maybe have a huge supply train or things connected. Water must be brought to people. It must be fresh water. It must be drinkable, of course. And and think what was behind that for a concentrated mass of 50,000 men in one spot. That blows your freaking mind, and it tells you how much the Persians were a dramatically advanced civilization that the Greeks couldn't even dream of at that point to be. And that it's a serious statement, right? Because here we're not talking about the fact that, again, normally the Persian wars are taken as, the Greeks at the end of the day were superior. Superior in what, right? In terms of military organization, definitely not. The Achaemenid army was dramatically more advanced. It's but then why did they win? Well, because, again, you can't win, even if you are a lesser civilization. There is really nothing strange to point out, but it's sad how people keep, thinking about military history like kind of a football match where they count victories and defeats, and, since somebody is defeated once, and say, oh, well, but, then it's as if they could be defeated any time. Military history, politics, right, it doesn't work like that, right? This is like a childish idea. It doesn't have any attendance with reality. Here we're talking about a massive expedition that could be successful as much as it was defeated. As we know, as Clausewitz, since these are things that you cannot predict with certainty, and surely there were problems, right? Massive, including this enormous logistical effort that was in fact pointed out by the same Herodotus, said, these armies would dry entire rivers, which, especially in some parts of Greece, given, the amount of water, might have not been unrealistic from a literal point of view. But all the other possible imaginable nuisances, the main, what Xerxes was told, your main enemies would be the lands and the sea, right? Properly in an extensional sense, because it would have costed an enormity and would have been incredibly complicated to maintain an effective logistical chain, right, from the heartlands of the empire and throughout all the western provinces to campaign in Greece, right? But just the fact that the Achaemenid Empire could put that together is a testament to their civilizational advancement. You can easily screw things up, militarily speaking, even if you're a civilization. Yes, right. There is no magic formula there. And remember, 480 BC. I don't know if you picture exactly in the scale of also military history of development, the capacity of armies, etc., together with the political dimension. How early this is in time in the annals of military history. So let's simply list the forces first of all, and then comment on them. So basically, it starts with the infantry forces that, at least numerically, were the most important ones. And the first one are basically these guards: 1,000 picked Persians, quote, with spears reversed, and 1,000 noble Persian, quote, apple bearers. There were some basically standards attached to the spears, etc. We don't have time to comment on that. We will surely make videos describing the various typologies of Achaemenid trooper, but these were fundamentally the elite, as you understand. Picked troops, nobility, right, 2,000. And here we have the explicitation of the number. So I will say it at any time as the source states, right? Then about the rest, basically, aside from the corresponding in cavalry forces, there is no such thing, if not for the number of ships. For the naval forces, that were crucial to, as we've seen, supply the army. Then you have 10,000 immortals, right? And now we will basically list the typology of trooper and the name of the commander as it goes by the source. So what the immortals would be in this regard, let's say an intent, properly professionally trained corps, right? That were famous because they said they could never basically fall under could never be under strength because somebody would always resupply them. They were a bit the pride of the Medes and the Persians, and had a figure as Sparabara, right? And we know, by the way, as in general, that they were equipped mostly with this formula that comes back also in other from iconography, etc., with the spearman slash bowman, right, which was traditional of the Median tradition, also the Persian, but the bow had a dramatic importance. We've seen it at some point. We're talking about Assyrian tactics in pre-Achaemenid times, and this corpse that fundamentally stands out and is enumerated, quantified numerically as such, commanded by Darnus and made up of what were called as sparabar, that were fundamentally this infantry troops. Then there are other corps here. So the Persians, and here goes with the ethnic contingent, the typology trooper, and commander. So the Persians, Sparabara Otanes. The Medes, Sparabara Tigranes. By the way, what is fascinating, we'll point out, is that all the commanders, as we'll see, also of different peoples, were fundamentally Median Persian noblemen, right? So this also stresses the fact that, as we will see with the problem of the numbers, these contingents were not like enormous bodies of troops commanded by foreign, of allies, of subjects, and so on. They were framed as properly a contingent within the Achaemenid army as such, right? Which speaks also for a very good and kind of rigid organization under which these troops were posed. Well, you find the Kissians, Sparabara Anaphis, the Hyrcanians, Sparabara Megapanus, the Assyrians, Hoplites. Consider that this is an Hellenic source, and that hoplite doesn't mean anything else in Hellenic sources, but fundamentally heavy infantry, right? Hoplites were called the Romans, the Celts, the Carthaginians, and that has zero, but I mean literally zero, to do any kind of hoplitic warfare, as we have narrowed it down to what the Athenians and the Spartans only did, right? Even within the same Greece, right? Because hoplitism was fundamentally just about those two cities, and the others was something else. It was gradually turning into something else. So never buy the myth that somebody who is called hoplite is literally a guy who fights in hoplitic tactics, or even just with the hoplitic equipment, the Hellenic hoplitic equipment, because that has nothing to do with military history, and we know it pretty well by this time. So in this sense, the Assyrians are represented as heavy troops, which is interesting, by the way. Then the Chaldeans, archers, we don't know actually. Some here I will say when it's conjectural or not. Commanded by Otaspes, Bactrians, equipped with bow and spear. We don't know who commanded them. The Saka, probably archers. Eustaspes, Indians and another group known as Asiatic Ethiopians. They were archers. Farnazatres, Arrayans, bow/spear Sisamnes, Parthians, and Chorasmians, with bow and spear, commanded by Artabazus. By the way, before I said the Assyrians, we don't know who commanded them, but actually, or the Bactrians, etc. But these were together with the following ethnicities, actually. I should point it out now. So this then the in fact the Parthians and the Chorasmians, equipped with bow and spear, commanded by Artabazus. The Sogdians, equipped with bow and spear, commanded by Azanes. The Gandarians and the Dadikai, equipped with bow and spear, commanded by Artiphius. The Caspians, archers, commanded by Ariomardus. The Sarangai, equipped with bow and spear, commanded by Ferendates. The Bactrians, equipped with bow, commanded by Artaintes. Utioi and Mucioi, archers, commanded by Arsamenes. The Paricanioi, archers, commanded by Syrometras. Arabs, equipped as archers, and Ethiopians, bow/spears, commanded by Arsames. Libyans, javelins, commanded by Massages. Paphlagonians and Matieni, javelins commanded by Dotus, Mariandunoi, Ligies, Cappadocians, equipped with javelins commanded by Gobrias, Phrygians and Armenians, javelins commanded by Artocmus, Lydians, Hoplites and Mysians, javelins commanded by Artaphernes actually, Bithynians, javelins commanded by Bassacus, Pisidians, Cabelaes, Miliae, javelins commanded by Badgers, Moscoi, Tibarenoi, spears commanded by Ariomartus, Macrones, Mosunoikoi, spears commanded by Artaictus, Mares, javelins and Colchians, spears commanded by Pharandatus, Alarodioi and Susparis, spears commanded by Masistius, and also the Persian Gulf exile islanders, Sparabara, commanded by Mardontes. So altogether they are fundamentally 30 corps, right? Because it's 29 plus the mortals and that initial elite that we have seen. Then passing to cavalry forces, we have mirroring that elite that at the beginning of infantry forces, there are 1,000 picked Persians marching before Xerxes and 1,000 picked Persians marching behind Xerxes, right? Of course, cavalry being needed properly in that kind of more dynamic, flexible capacity in the vanguard and rearguard. So these are elite, and they are properly here. They figure as picked. Probably they also were nobility, as we pointed out in for the noble Persians, at least in the infantry force. Then these are in two corps fundamentally. The Persians, equipped with armor, bow, and spear, together with the Sargatians, equipped with lasso. Then the Maids with armor, bow, and spears, the Kissians with armor, bow, and spear, the Indians with cavalry and chariots, the Bactrians with bow and spear, the Saka, that actually in the text are called Caspioi, but since they're mentioned again a couple of sentences later, the duplication is a mistake. So we know, for example, at the Battle of Plataea, Saka cavalry was there. So their absence from the list is also a mistake, and probably the first Caspioi also received should be Saka themselves. Then the Libyans with chariots, the Caspians with bow, the Paricanioi with bow, and the Arabs camel-mounted archers. So you understand here, evidently cavalry is less also than infantry altogether. It would be normal for Achaemenid armies in the first place. It's fundamentally a largely sedentary empire. But still, the importance of this cavalry is remarkable. And here we get, in fact, also somewhat, there is, let's say, cavalry is composed by troops that come from more peripheral areas of the empire on average, right? Aside from probably the Persians, the Maids, etc. But the others, compared to the infantry force, right, that is more thick in terms of geographical distribution within the imperial boundaries, here it's somewhat more distant. And one could even speculate on why and how, but it's still meaningful as a Then the naval forces that consider that in addition to the native marines that manned them, each ship carried 30 either of Persian, Maid, or Saka type, and this is fascinating because there is also the Sakas that normally basically not being much about maritime capabilities, but still being used by the Achaemenids as such, probably because of their dramatic missile capability that in naval warfare was at this time also more, was the most common form of combat aside from ramming and boarding that did happen. And so here we have the list of the nations, or the ethnicities, the number of ships, and the marines. Then the Phoenicians and the Palestinians. So these would be the best, right? In terms of maritime tradition, 300 ships and equipped with the marines equipped with javelins, right? The Egyptians, 200 ships, hoplites. The Cypriots, 150 ships, hoplites. The Cilicians, 100 ships, javelins. The Pamphylians, 30 ships, hoplites. The Lycians, 50 ships, bows, javelins. The Dorian Greeks, 30 ships, hoplites. The Carians, 70 ships, hoplites. Ionian Greeks, 100 ships, hoplites. Greek islands, 17 ships, hoplites. Aetolian Greeks, 60 ships, hoplites, and Pontic Greeks, 100 ships, hoplites. Right, and this also, if you sum up all the properly the amount of Hellenic contribution at sea to the Achaemenid effort, basically it surpasses that of any other people except the Phoenicians and the Palestinians, and which is remarkable, of course, as the Greeks were being fast, in maritime development, and as we know, they would even defeat the same Achaemenid force at Salami. There are some other problems here. For example, the name of Pisidians in among the infantry forces. Well, they do not appear in the manuscript, so it's a likely correction to fill a gap. Some of the Millians carried Lycian bows, right, either instead of or as well as their spears. Also, the Sagartians that were listed among the cavalry together with the Persians, were so, we hypothesize, because we're not actually sure whether each nation's cavalry were a separate unit, or whether, for example, the Bactrians and Sagar, the Caspians and Parikanioi were brigaded together, but these were left out, and therefore it's possible. Also, as you notice, we don't have the name of the individual commanding officers of the cavalry contingents, right? And we are given, however, the name of the three overall that are Armamitres, Tithaios, and Pharnuchas, and the latter actually being injured and not participating, being left behind. So, to this, as we were saying before, we have to add the troops that Xerxes added from subjugated nationalities. So, as you know, he crossed into Thrace from Asia Minor, and he subdued here, via land towards Greece in the southwest, the Thracians, the Paeonians, the Macedonians, and several, the same of northern and central Hellenic city-states, right? Also, as you understand, if we were to count the total amount of troops that Herodotus gives in 760, there would be fundamentally 1,700,000 infantry. So fundamentally an average of 60,000 for each of the 29 corps listed, while the cavalry, according to Herodotus 787, were 80,000, plus the camels and chariots that in 184 he recounts at 20,000. So this would be fundamentally the fighting force altogether. He in fact adds at some point also together with the numbers of the followers and non-combatants, other Europeans picked on the march, this grand total of 5,283,200 220, right? Including actually the army, the navy, and camp followers. So this number is insane, right? And of course, it doesn't mean anything, right? The 29 listed contingents didn't, of course, have an average of 60,000 infantry. The infantry altogether was not 1,700,000 men. Cavalry couldn't be 80,000, right? And even with all the field aides, people that came simply along the army, the navy, or along the coast, etc., the field aides, you don't reach 5 million and more, right? So what is the number that we can realistically put forward to say, okay, this was, as I said, it was probably something around 50,000 to me. As a fighting force plus field aides, right? And the navy could be something more, right? Surely, but that's not quite the same thing, though. And surely there were some marines that also fought on land at some point. You probably together also with the army, and there is no doubt that this thing suffered of supply shortages, even when it was reduced in size, for example, under Mardonius. And surely the logistical effort to put this army together was enormous, right? But this doesn't mean that has to be stratospheric numbers. 50,000 is already such a thing for those time standards, right? And simply it would have been impossible to sustain more. Think even about all the animals, right? That were in close support of these people, right? There are calculations, for example, that I don't know for a couple 100,000 plus several tens of thousands of animals that in order to support the 84 supply ships in continuous operations would have needed. And it's historically realistic that as many ships could have been provided, right, and kept working, right. Probably the size was much smaller, and we have some hints even from the campaign itself. For example, at the Battle of Plataea. Why? Because we know, but we don't have the full strength there explicitated, but we know, for example, that the Medes were drawn within the commanded army to face 8,900 Greeks, right? The Saga and Bactrians, who made up one contingent together, as we've seen, faced 5,400, but the Indians only 1,300, right? And we know that the Medes at least had already fought and even taken casualties at Thermopylae, especially. But a Median force that could be matched against 8,900 Greeks would be compatible with an original strength of 10,000 at the start of the expedition, which would defeat the known Achaemenid decimal organization that we've seen before. So perhaps the most important infantry contingents of Xerxes' army, as we've seen with the Immortals, were 10,000 strong, right? So the Persians themselves, the Medes, right? The Immortals, and probably not many more, right? Consider this depends mostly on how, because these would be, by the way, the most reliable troops. It would be properly the ethnicities of the core land of the empire, the ones that were more, properly engaged in the benefits of the imperial health and this war of expansion. So of course they were the ones that also within the army had to maintain, as a core force, the loyalty of all the other contingents that, as you understand, were relatively less interested to go fight and die in a faraway land such as Greece was in inside. So it's realistic to think that the other ethnic contingents were actually much smaller. We're talking about in the range of the the thousands or the even the hundreds on some occasion. This is for the infantry and plus cavalry together. So it's important to stress this, because if you from Plataea you make a parallel, you mirror these forces in proportion. You from the Achaemenid side, you can get that quite likely they were something around 50,000 maximum at the beginning of the campaign. At that time, probably less, right? Like 40,000 or something. And consider that these elite troops, such as the Immortals and also the best Achaemenid forces, such as the Persians and the Maids themselves, were the ones also less liable to desertion, whereas the others probably would, as we've seen, would be less motivated. So, all in all, right, even for the same effectiveness of the same army, the important was this, could say, national core of the Achaemenid Empire, and the rest would be kind of a couture, right? For example, the Bactria Sacket force that faced 5,400 Greeks might have started war like something like 5,000 or 6,000 strong. The Indians might have not surpassed the 2,000, right? So there can't be some kind of other consideration that can be done numerically, but I would say that no, these forces didn't surpass properly the 50,000, especially as an integral army, right? Detachments, as we've seen, naval forces, etc., might have surely added consistently to the numbers, the aides, etc., the civilians, because the army was naturally followed by all a bureaucracy, an administration, organization, the court. All these things weighed on logistics as much as the army. Sometimes, less. In insight, it was important to have the King of Kings there, right? From a moral point of view. So those costs and the magnificence of it and so on of the court would have been a positive factor after all. We may have some other hint, maybe the fact that Lydians might have been an important contingent, because the story of Pythios, told in Herodotus 7:38-39, suggests at least an oppressively thorough levy, and therefore, we can hypothesize that. Speaking of cavalry, Herodotus 7:41 speaks of 10,000 Persians, as well as the guard units. So, if, as with infantry, other national contingents were smaller, total cavalry might have not exceeded the, probably the same tens of thousands, actually, which we can simply say, okay, Herodotus is simply saying, those are just the Persians, but actually it's the whole cavalry force, but likely, right? This army, we'll see it in other videos, surely had an important quota of cavalry. It doesn't have to be underestimated in that moment in history, not just for the Achaemenids, actually. Even about the Greeks, we would be surprised to see how, equestrian warfare was there from the quasi non-existent that is often pictured for them. But aside from that, that is a marginal remark anyway. I think that 10,000 may be realistically, incidentally, the same, the total of the Achaemenid cavalry force, right? Which is already a pretty bulky one. And consider all the field aids, etc. The Achaemenids already at this time had, had always had actually a stratified, segmented typology of cavalry. Like, they had the ultra heavy ones. They had chariots, by the way. But the majority would be fundamental medium cavalry or light one, also coming from these other peoples, as we've seen from the fringes of the empire, mostly, right? So these are my numbers, and I I know that not just for this topic, but in general, I always look literally to the lowest estimates, because it's a matter of properly of or kind of command limit. At that time, there were no structures. Doesn't matter how organized, how developed, etc. But you couldn't properly hope to control functionally 50,000 people. They could bring more than that on the field, but how do you command them? How do you even find a space for maneuvering? What do you think that the whole thing is gonna, how is it gonna be realistically healthy, even just to think that all that massive troop would have been tactically functional in a qualitative sense? And in this sense, we have to also think that and this say shines through, in my opinion, when looking at the broader thoroughness of the Achaemenid organization for the 480 campaign. But this was probably a normal thing for Achaemenid standards, given their resources, their military tradition, etc., progressed organization experience, a very well organized, very well disciplined army as well, right? We know it. What I was saying at the beginning is that, of course, the Persians were a much more developed military culture than the Greeks. I mean, they had a level of collective training that the Greeks could only dream of, right? The Greeks know, basically most Greeks were just part-time militia. Just the Spartans, basically, as an elite, performed in contained numbers this kind of intense training, etc. But the truth being that certain maneuvers that were performed also with a combination of combined arms, etc. in the field by the Persians, the Greeks couldn't perform, and this idea of greatness that you see, there was something terroristic in the way Xerxes, advanced towards even just the size of the army in itself, right? But the objective was naturally to properly subdue, to crush, like in the first Persian War. Actually, the Hellenic resistance must not be given for granted. Right, this is very important to stress. There was a political flexibility in the war process. Famously enough, also in the Hellenic polis, there was a resurgence of monarchy, aristocratic governments in imitation, actually, to the Achaemenid model. The Persian Wars changed the story there, but also it was a flexible, different reality. If battles had gone differently, we easily, if you know the Battle of Marathon, if you have you see how easily things go otherwise, right? And so there is also nothing so strange about this, the attempt to subdue it, as grandiose as it sounded. But probably, speaking of the quality of the army and also the equipment, etc., there would be a lot to tell, right? Because according to me, even the fact that we've seen before, these troops were all framed under the Median Persian commanders, right? So this is fascinating because it sounds like a particularly well-ordered and structured army, right? Herodotus says that it took 4 years to assemble it, with all the preparations and everything. There was a lot of show-off as well, but probably this was one of a very finely kept army, right? Properly as availability of resources, etc. And that is what you really want to have when you have such huge numbers, right? You don't want to have more people. It's anti-logical from a military point of view. You want to have better people. You want to increase the quality, the collective training, the level of cohesion, and the amount of the availability of supplies, etc. And that costs, as we've seen, dramatically more than just bringing another guy on the field. But that's where the Achaemenid would have invested the most, because they of course knew that extra guy in the field would have not actually made the difference. And these are deep reasons in strategic culture. They're not just, speculation, right? So, and it fits with a realistic military organization. Then, of course, we can imagine overall that aside from the army, there were other contingents, militias, etc., that were kind of following the wave, right, and propagating and occupying and garrisoning, etc. But of course, those also costed, right? So, functionally speaking, the important was, for the sake of deterrence and properly of control on all this, it's for the Achaemenid army on the field to maintain cohesion and compact, right, and to not also to waste time, which Greeks, as you know, managed also to look at what happened on Cape Artemision, or there are many. We'll have to study the campaign, of course, but that was naturally, in a sense, the Schwerpunkt of the same army, right? It's logistics. The fact that the longer it stayed out there, and the more it weighed, and the more it could be worn down and lose its quality, its cohesion, its morale, etc. And how things ended eventually. But it's important, and I made this video, I must say, also properly to stress the numerical side, the dimensional aspect properly, and that is more important sometimes than even just what were these guys equipped like or whatever. It's not even important, right? It's not, again, that the Persian wars were won or lost over the fact that the Greeks fought as a phalanx, or that the Achaemenids had a different, greater reliance on combined arms, etc. It was, of course, a political thing, because of its in terms, and then strategical, and then just, of course, battles make also strategy by themselves, but they can happen only if something happened before, right? And that is what brought them to be there, and the expectation of victory from both sides that flows on a much greater balance than whatever the technique or the equipment or whatever fighting is on the field, right? So yeah, and there is so much to tell about this campaign. It is almost embarrassing to present such an important topic like the order of battle of the Achaemenid invasion force like this, but it's a beginning, all right? We will talk probably more about Hellenic and also Hellenistic history. We have to do something about this. I'm not entirely sure whether I should properly start like a manualistic Hellenic/Hellenistic history, like I do for the Romans, for example. I don't want to turn Schwerpunkt mostly into an ancient history channel, but aside from the fact of always being passionate about it, but it's important to complete sometimes some gaps, because otherwise it seems things started with Alexander and then with the Romans, etc., and then not quite so. Of course, it's important to understand where these peoples came from. I also started a series of Bronze Age warfare, for that matter. It's also very fascinating, but at that point, you look at some typology of troopers, and you see just some Egyptian artisan evidence, and you say, what the hell, can I make a video on this? Right? Sometimes it's frustrating, but I'll think about that, right? Even if we can't do something more construct, like talking about campaigns and battles specifically. I don't do campaign videos mostly, right? Because they're complex and I need more extensive script and more work. But I think we can do something like this to understand properly, especially this time, as early as it is, as starts being well recorded by Hellenic historiography. So we get, and I mean, you read Thucydides and you that blows your mind. That's basically Western thought incarnate, right, to this day. But the question is, we also have to expand it to be able to look beyond at some point. And as you understand, I like very much the Achaemenid Empire. I have very deep respect and admiration and actually amazement towards the capacities of these, with also with their limits, but surely not in the way they were depicted in a broader sense as kind of the struggle of Westerners towards the barbarian hordes of the East. That's not even comic books reach. That comic books are a serious thing in comparison to these ideas. But aside from this, we'll see. We'll see about that. For now, I just hope that you enjoyed this video. If you did, please share it. Otherwise, leave a like or subscribe to my channel if you're interested in my upcoming content. And for now, I thank you heartily for listening to me. I wish you a nice time and see you next time. Bye.